God. God's always recording. That's the message. All right. We're going to get rolling here. Welcome. We got a full room today. This is fun. I see a lot of new faces. So welcome to the Village Central Teaching. My name is Jason. If you haven't met me, we are going through a series. We are studying the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a book in the Old Testament, and it's kind of a strange book to choose for a series. I think you'll see why that is here in a minute. But this book is packed with hard-hitting reflections about life that really they're refreshing if you understand them correctly in light of who God is. We're going to talk about that. So why don't we have one or two people pray, and I'll close this out, and we'll get rolling here. Thank you for this opportunity to come together and just pray that you Yeah, I agree, God. I'm really thankful that your word doesn't shy away from the realities of life, that you don't shy away from the realities of life. And I pray that we would be encouraged today by that fact, and that we really know that you're in us in the midst of the realities of living in a broken world. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I stole this from Stu, if it'll let me. He used this last week, and it was such a good quote that I wanted to take it. So in his book, Recovering Eden, Swine, I don't know how you say his name, he says this about the book of Ecclesiastes as a whole. In Ecclesiastes, God intends you to know him by requiring you to look plainly and without polish at yourself, your neighbors, and the world in which you and I live. And so not just in our time today, but throughout this series in Ecclesiastes, we're going to deal with some harsh realities and some harsh conclusions that the author is going to have. And it might make us squirm a little bit. You might be thinking at certain points, like, isn't church supposed to be happy? But I just want you to take a breath in those moments, because Solomon, who is the author, he's referred to in the passage as the preacher. Solomon himself is willing to examine his own life with startling honesty. And so in order for us to get anything out of this teaching and out of this book, we need to be willing to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it would be. And so today we're going to talk some about wisdom, and Solomon's going to talk a lot about wisdom. And so to define wisdom, really it's the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. And I highlighted experience because I think when I think of wisdom, I think of like an old man. Like if you're Lord of the Rings guy, Gandalf, I think of an old man who has gone through life. And the difference between wisdom and knowledge is the application of knowledge as facts. When I was a senior in high school, I tried to find it. I don't have my senior yearbook, which sucks. But my senior quote, I thought it was so clever at the time, was this quote I had heard, which is, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. Right? So it's like, yeah, okay, it's a fruit, but if you put a tomato with your kiwis and bananas, it's going to throw the whole thing off, right? And so that probably comes through experience. I'm sure some idiot put tomatoes in his fruit salad and it sucked. And so I really like the experience aspect of wisdom, that having gone through life, you grow through wisdom. You grow in wisdom. And so Solomon, again, our author, is going to reflect on this wisdom. Now, who here has read a research paper before? Okay, Stu. So Stu is going to notice, I actually Googled it. This is one of Stu's research papers. And we're going to talk about the fracturing social, no, we're not. But this is a research paper, right? And so in the research paper, you see at the top there's a thing called an abstract. An abstract, it's like a short summary of the research paper, and it gives an overview of the study conducted for the paper. It's like a quick little bite, like, hey, here's what you're looking at. I personally am only guilty of only reading the abstract, which I'm sure Stu can relate to. But you can kind of look at Ecclesiastes as kind of an ancient research paper. And the first chapter that we went over last week was kind of like the abstract, where Solomon comes out the gate and he gives us the conclusion of the study. And now in our time together today, he's going to start to go into how he got to that conclusion. And so, so to recap from last week, right out of the gate, Solomon says, vanity of vanities. Now, pop quiz, who remembers the Hebrew word for vanity? Does anyone remember? Stu, you can't answer. What? Habel. Nailed it. This word means fleeting. It actually means breath or vapor. It's also used to mean kind of futile or pointless. Most translations translate it as meaningless. And so I'm a big fan of the term futile or useless, and you'll kind of see why as we work through the text today. And I want to reiterate something Stu said last week, which is that Solomon himself isn't truly a nihilist. A nihilist is someone who thinks there is no purpose to life. And there's going to be points today where it's going to seem like he's a nihilist, but he's not, because he actually gives instructions on how to live a good life, right? And he wouldn't give instructions on how to live a good life if it was all meaningless anyways. And so I like this term futile or pointless. And so there's kind of two big conclusions from last week's teaching. One, life is a breath. It could be over at any moment. We all know this. We've experienced tragedy. We have the news. We see that life comes out of nowhere. As the commercials say, life comes at you fast. We also know that we will die and we will be forgotten under the sun. I'm really morbid. I liked that animation. I thought it was funny. Like, you will be forgotten. And so I have a morbid sense of humor. We'll talk about that. It's how I cope. But and so like after last week, you might be kind of feeling like, man, thanks Solomon, thanks Stu. Like, that's a really awesome principle. I'm going to die and I'm going to be forgotten. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth today. So I'm just going to read through our passage. We actually have two passages we're going to work through. And so this is the first one. I'm just going to go ahead and read through it. The preacher, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind. There's actually one more verse that I'm leaving off for now. We're going to come back to it later. And so just to go through. So we see the preacher, think Solomon, King Solomon. I don't think that's an actual picture, but he was the king over Israel for a long time. He was actually the son of David, if you've heard of King David. And so he says here, he applied his heart to search out by wisdom all that is done in heaven. Now, to search out here, it means to explore, and all that is done is basically life. So he's exploring all that life has to offer, meaning Solomon is kind of giving us his research method. Remember the research paper example? He's going to examine several aspects and ventures in life, and he's going to pursue them to their furthest ends. We'll talk about that a little more in a moment. And he concludes, I've seen in everything, and behold, all is vanity, all is fleeting. And it's like everything, all is vanity. He also uses this term striving after the wind. This really lends itself to this idea of breath and vapor with the word habel. Have you ever tried to catch the wind? Like, have you ever just reached out and tried to grab it, right? It's impossible. I think Eminem has a song where he talks about, like, I grabbed a tornado and put it in a bottle. And it's like, no, you didn't. Like, you can't do that. Not the last airbender. It's impossible. It's gone as fast as it came. And really, it's a waste of time to really even try to catch it. And then he goes on. He says, what is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. I love this. So Solomon often speaks in proverbs and sayings throughout his writings. There is a book called Proverbs that he wrote most of, where he just kind of speaks in these little one-liners, like as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another, right? And he kind of breaks into one here. This, what is crooked cannot be made straight. And here he's observing the brokenness that's apparent in the world. The scientific term for this is actually entropy. And so I hope my friend Cameron isn't watching. I sent him the link because he's like a physicist. and he won't be satisfied with this explanation. But entropy is this concept that the universe is in a state of disorder or randomness. Like things don't just fall into place. It takes guiding forces to make them fall into place. And this can be observed in physical nature and in life also. This little graphic here shows it. Basically, the idea is like if you tossed a pile of bricks off a truck, which of the two piles are you more likely to see? You're probably more likely to see the right one, right? And this is what Solomon's getting at. It's like things don't fall into place. Things don't go the way that they should. He also reflects on this later in Ecclesiastes in chapter 9. He says, again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. Things don't follow order. The world is broken. And again, at this point, you might be like, okay, where does it turn around? When's it going to get better? At this point, it's not. And this is why I love the Bible. It's honest about the state of affairs in the world. I grew up in a church environment where it was all smiles. Everything's awesome. I describe it as Lego church, Lego movie church, of like, everything is awesome. Jesus really cool. You should join his team. Like that's the flavor of church that I grew up with. And it was really an environment of don't show your brokenness. Don't ask tough questions. I was literally told, like, don't ask that. We're not going to talk about that. And was told this idea of like, we should put on our best for God. But as I got older into my teenage years and I started reading the Bible, I read Ecclesiastes. And it's like, the world is messed up and broken. And I was like, yes, thank you. We can talk about it. It was refreshing to see that in God's word, the brokenness of the world and the resulting melancholy within myself, God wasn't afraid to address that or approach that. And so I just want to say, if you're here and you're wrestling with the brokenness of the world, or you're wrestling with inner doubt and feeling like you're inconsistent with yourself and you don't even know what you believe, you don't even know who you really are, just want you to know you're not alone and you don't have to hide that or camouflage it, especially not in this church. If you just talk to people and get to know them, we will all be honest and be like, yep, I've thought that question. I've also doubted the existence of God. I've also really struggled. You're not alone in that. And it's crazy to see 3,000 years ago when this was written that Solomon himself was observing this. Going back to our passage, in verse 16, he says, I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. So he says, I've acquired great wisdom. And so Stu mentioned this last week, but there's a story in the Old Testament where God basically tells Solomon, asks Solomon, what do you want? Solomon says, I would like to have wisdom. God thinks that's a really good answer. And he gives him wisdom, but he also gives him all the material blessings that you would expect someone to ask for. And so he says, my heart has had great experience. And so because of Solomon's vast resources, wealth, and power, Solomon was able to experience life at a level that nobody in this room will come close to. And I think this is really important for understanding. Like, if I were to just walk up to you on the street and you don't know me, and I said, hey, life is vanity, you're going to die and you're going to be forgotten, you might be like, who in the world are you? Who do you think you are? Why would you say that to me? And so I think it's important that we know who is saying these things, who has the right to make these claims. So we're going to talk a little bit about Solomon's ventures in life. So, money. It's generally agreed that Solomon was one of the wealthiest men in history, if not the wealthiest. One article I found estimated his wealth to be $2.1 trillion in his day and age. So he would make Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, like they're all paupers compared to our guy Solomon. He actually had this throne that was really famous, and I found this quote. Listen to this. King Solomon's throne was coated in pure gold and inlaid with ivory. All of the goblets and household articles in Solomon's palace were pure gold. He was reportedly so rich that during the years of his reign over Jerusalem, the immense wealth caused silver to be considered of little value and as common as rocks. As such, nothing in Solomon's palace was made of silver. So like in a day and age where like gold and silver, that's the currency of the day, like he made $100 bills worthless. Like that's kind of the idea of like, this is how crazy rich he was and how crazy rich Jerusalem was. And like, that's his chair. Like, think about the nice stuff you have. That's just his chair. This is my chair. And it was free. Shout out to the Heckmans. So like when it comes to money, when it comes to material possessions, I'm not going to ever get close to what Solomon experiences. And frankly, everyone in this room combined isn't going to get close to what Solomon experiences. Talk about the next venture in life. What about pleasure, having a good time? Well, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he had no want for sexual fulfillment. So if you, this idea of like, oh, if she had this color eyes, or like if he has big arms, he's 6 foot, or like whatever your parameters are for sexual fulfillment, he's like, yeah, I had 1,000 women. I wasn't satisfied by it. He also throws some crazy parties that I'm not going to go into detail on, because that's what Jeff is going to talk about next week, is the vanity of pleasure. But I'll just say this, that the dude partied his face off for years. And it made your little frat soiree kind of look pathetic in comparison. And I had a note here about the wives and concubines. Just a reminder that this is descriptive, not prescriptive, right? So Solomon has 1,000 wives, and it's not like, and God saw that it was good. Like, no, in fact, at the end of Solomon's life, God punishes him because he allows his wives to turn him away from God. And so just a reminder that the Bible is mostly a historical document. So when you read things like that and you're like, wait, this isn't a good thing. Like, God actually is going to agree with you. Like, that's not a good thing, but it's what happened. And like I said before, God's not going to pretty things up to be better than they actually are. And really the point here is that hedonism, which is this idea of the pursuit of pleasure being man's fulfillment, that if something makes you happy, if something makes you feel good, then you should pursue it. It's a lie. And it's a lie according to the man who pursued pleasure better than any of us. A couple more ventures. How about hobbies, right? So you got a little like spice garden in your kitchen, or maybe for me, it's actually like working on our house, which I'm always behind on. Solomon planted gardens, and he literally planted forests. So your little tomato garden is going to look kind of pathetic compared to what Solomon's able to do. He actually had these things called the pools of Solomon that are still, you can still go see them today. They were aqueducts, Simon, how are you? Aqueducts, basically giant pools of water just to support his ventures in these gardens and forests. And they were so huge and expansive that today you can still go to Israel and see them. He actually, it says in Ecclesiastes that he brought in music and singers from all around the world. So One Direction, The Weeknd, whatever your flavor of music is, like he got to see the best music, the best entertainment of his day and age. What about career? Well, he built the first temple in Jerusalem. That temple stood a long time. By the way, it eventually was destroyed, which Solomon would go, of course it was. He also had a 13-year project to build a royal palace. And so massive expansion of the kingdom, massive success. He was an incredibly successful king of a nation. And I don't know about any of you. I got promoted one time when I was in college from a teller to like a personal banker. And I was like, yo, I'm a personal banker. That's kind of pathetic compared to the king of a nation. And so if you name an aspect of life that you would say will satisfy you, or will fulfill you, or that's your purpose in life, Solomon's going to say to us, yeah, I did that bigger and better and longer than you will ever come even close to. And what was his conclusion? It was vanity of vanities. And so just for reference, as we hear these things today, just know that this isn't just somebody saying these things. This is someone who really experienced life at a level that we can't. Going back into passage, he says that he applied his heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And so just to cover his bases, basically, Solomon says, I lived wisely, but I also lived unwisely. And again, I don't want to give away Jeff's teaching, but I'll just say this. Solomon knows what it means to have a good time. He knows what it means to really pursue the world and pleasure for all that it's worth. And he concludes by saying it's a striving after the wind. And it doesn't really matter where you land between these two ends of the spectrum of wisdom and madness and folly. Regardless, it's striving after the wind. It's habal, it's futile, trying to catch the wind. In our next passage, he goes on to say in chapter 2, and again, I'm going to read through the whole thing and we'll go through it. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more to gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance. Seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten, how the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after wind. And so, yeah, he says this idea of what can man do who comes after the king? This harkens back to our passage last week where Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. And Stu talked about this last week, but like, if you hear there's nothing new under the sun and you're like, I don't think Solomon had an iPhone, that's pretty new. Solomon would say, cool, you invented a better way for you to miscommunicate and hurt other people. I mean, if we're honest, if we reflect as a society, has technology made us better, or has it really kind of brought out the worst in us? I mean, yeah, I could go on about it, but I'm gonna stop there. And again, Solomon lived a pretty crazy, productive life. And so what he's saying here is, how can my son, who's gonna be the next king, outdo me? Like, what's going to ultimately satisfy him? 2,000 wives? Like 3 temples, $10 trillion? Like, when is enough enough? It's never enough. He reflects on this in Ecclesiastes 8. He says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes sleep. Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Now, whenever it says find it out, this is the Hebrew word matzah. It means like to attain. So it's not like finding, it's like to acquire something. And in other words, whatever venture that you pursue in life, you'll never arrive. You never get to the point where it's enough money, it's enough pleasure, it's enough success. If you pursue life for all that it's worth, Solomon's like, I did it. I took it farther than anyone ever has or ever will. And it's vanity. It's never enough. And yeah, the wise man, he might realize this. So he's like, hey, I was self-aware. Like, I realized it and I still can't find it out. So it's like, even if I'm wise, I still am not fulfilled. I'm actually, well, I'm not going to give that away. I almost gave away a thing later. Even though I'm wise, I still can't acquire it. And so going back to chapter 2, he says, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. So wait, so wisdom is better than folly. And I thought they were both vanity. Like, how can they both be, or how can one be better if they're both vanity and a waste of time? And this kind of points to this idea of like, meaningless isn't quite the right word here, because life isn't truly pointless, or Solomon wouldn't say one is better than the other. And so even though they are ultimately vanity under the sun, it's fair to say that it's better to live a wise life. Life will tend to go better for those who seek to apply wisdom in their lives than fools who live blindly. But even though, living wisely is better, you'll probably have a better life. I perceive the same event happens. What event happens? Death. Exactly. Death happens to everyone. I originally had like a silly picture of a Grim Reaper, and I was like, that's too silly. This is like heavy. like the same thing happens to the wise and to the fool. And he reflects on this. He says, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why have I been wise? So he's like, why? I'm going to die just like that idiot? Like, dude, Tony, he's a moron. He's probably looking at someone going like, I'm going to die just like he had. He's going to. For of the wise as of the fool, there's no enduring remembrance. So I'm going to die just like that idiot, and I'm going to be forgotten, and my riches are going to go to someone else, and my legacy will eventually fade. Now, when I read this, I was like, wait, I have an objection, because Solomon, we're still talking about you, right? It's been 3,000 years, and I'm still talking about Solomon, king of Israel. So I don't know. It seems like there's a remembrance, and Solomon's response would be, just give it some more time. Just wait. In fact, what we know now scientifically is that eventually the sun, the thing that by which life grows on planet Earth, it's going to explode. Now, it's going to be a long time, like millions of years. But if the natural order of things continues, right, the ultimate destiny of humanity is it's going to explode. He didn't even know that. And if we would have told him that, he would have been like, yeah, that tracks. That kind of makes sense. There's this quote from a guy named Jacob Needleman. He said, and this guy's not a Christian, by the way, but he's a philosopher. He says, death is the great equalizer. I've seen that phenomenon many times. I've had people in my classes come to me, men and women over 50 years old, and they say, I made it, I'm rich, but what the hell is my life for? And so, this idea of the great equalizer. It's like, man or woman, you're going to die. Rich or poor, you're going to die. Old or young, you're going to die. It's the one thing in this room that we all have in common. And it's this really uncomfortable thing that we really try to avoid. And as you get older, you get closer and closer to that expiration date. You start to feel it. And you start to go, what did I live my life for? And Solomon's reflecting on this. And so his conclusion, he says, so I hated life. He gets to the end of all of it. He experiences life for all that it's worth. He's done his experiment, and his inner conclusion is, I hate it. Everything is grievous to me. And that's our teaching today. So thank you for coming out. Right? I mean, at this point, you might be thinking like, man, I'm really glad I made it to church this Sunday. This is awesome. And so Solomon hates life, though. But why is this? And we're going to come back to his despair here in a moment. But right now, we're going to jump back to the end of chapter 1. I mentioned that we skipped a verse, or we left a verse off. So we're going to go back, and I'm going to read 17 as well. He says, I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So Solomon reflects that, like, the more that you grow in understanding, the more you tend to grow in grief. This word for vexation is grief. It's like, it's sorrow. It actually, inversely, it kind of reflects the idea of ignorance is bliss, right? It's like, just, it's better not to know. Like, let him play in the mud, it's fine. Like, he's having fun. Because if he knows, he's going to be grossed out. And so as we go through life and we experience it for what it is, we become more and more acutely aware of how broken life really is. Like, as a kid, I didn't really have a concept of death. I've lost some loved ones. I've got a better concept of death now. And actually, I want to go through some of the most brilliant minds in history were also tortured by depression and anxiety, and it kind of came in different forms and in different ways. And the reason I want to talk about this is because this experience is not unique to Solomon, and I think we all experience this at some level. Honest Abe, man, his face is huge on the screen. Abe Lincoln, in order to get through life on a day-to-day basis, he often told jokes or strange stories at inappropriate times. He is my soulmate. That is exactly how I respond. Like, when my wife is mad at me, I laugh. It's literally involuntary. And she'll be mad and I can't stop giggling, and it really calms her down. She's watching that right now. I love you, babe. His law partner, William Herndon, once noted that Lincoln's melancholy dripped from him as he walked. I love that picture of, like, he was just a sad guy. And really, his sorrow, it came from the pressures of life, the pressures of public life. I found something today, actually, that he really wasn't that depressed in his 20s and early 30s. It was as he got older and started feeling the pressures of life that the melancholy began to seep in. And he had notably poor self-worth. He thought he wasn't worth a hill of beans. Sorry, I'm from Texas. We say stuff like that. Next guy, Mark Twain, famous author. He passed through a period of deep depression, which began in 1896 when his daughter Susie died of meningitis. Olivia's death, his wife, in 1904, and Jean's death, his daughter, on December 24th, 1909, deepened his gloom. And on May 20th, 1909, his close friend Henry Rogers died suddenly. And so Mark felt the sorrow from the loss of loved ones and this reality of death that Solomon is reflecting on. C.S. Lewis, if you've ever read or I guess watched the Chronicles of Narnia, he's kind of a theological giant in Christianity. He had this quote that I loved it. I hope you can read it. He says, I am writing really for company, for I'm a sad ass at the moment. I've been going through, yeah, I know, I'm childish, I had to include that. He says, I've been going through one of those periods when one can no longer disguise the fact that movement has been backwards, not forward. All the sins one thought one had escaped have been back again as strong as ever. And then he breaks out in a little poem. He says, all our former pain and all of our surgeon's care are lost in all the unbearable in vain, born once it is still to bear. So he says the surgeon, he has a book called A Grief Observed. If you are struggling with loss, I can't recommend A Grief Observed more. What it is, it's a book where he reflects on the loss of his own life. He didn't get married until later in his life. He often reflected that he felt like he just couldn't meet anyone who was intellectually his equal, which sounds kind of arrogant, but for a guy this smart, it's kind of honest. Like, I don't know, man. And he meets a woman, I think in his late 30s, early 40s, and she's smarter than he is. And he describes how she routinely teaches him things, and they get married and fall in love. She gets cancer and she dies, I think within a year or two of them getting married. And A Grief Observed is a publication of his journals as he's working through, God, why would this happen? The pains of that life. And he describes God as the surgeon who cuts things away. And so it's just something about that really spoke to me, just the sorrow that results from struggles with brokenness and loss in the world, and also loss within. He talks about in the quote that all the sins that he thought had been escaped are back and they're stronger than ever. So as we go through life and we're struggling with our inner hypocrisy and our inner inconsistency, he went through that as well. Charles Spurgeon, he is often referred to as the Prince of Preachers. He had a mega church in like the 1800s at a time when that wasn't a concept really, because he would just draw these massive crowds. His form of despair is the one I relate to the most. He says this, he's old school, so it's kind of hard to read sometimes, but hang with me. He says, as well fight with the mist as with the shapeless, undefinable, yet all beclouding hopelessness. One affords himself no pity when in this case, because it seems to be unreasonable and even sinful to be troubled without manifest cause, and yet troubled the man is. Even in the very depths of his spirit, it needs a heavenly hand to push it back. But nothing short of this will chase away the nightmare of the soul. This idea of sorrow in the soul and depression without clear cause. I've struggled with depression my whole life. And there's been days where I don't get out of bed for 8 hours, and I couldn't tell you why that is. There's just this inner brokenness that he himself fought his whole life as he served God and expanded the kingdom. So getting back to our friend Solomon, when he says, I hated life because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. Like, how relatable is this reaction, right? Just the humanity of Solomon and the humanity seen in the Bible. It's totally rational. And so for my melancholy brothers and sisters in the room, if you struggle with depression, I want you to know you're not alone in this. The Bible doesn't shy away from that. We as a village, as a church body, we're not going to shy away from that. And honestly, for me, I know it's kind of sadistic and maybe I'm morbid, but I kind of love this because the stark reality of the Bible is refreshing to me. Like, I'll take honest despair over fake joy every day of the week. I would rather be able to be authentic and honest about what I'm struggling with and have to put on a front and pretend things are better than they actually are. And actually, so would Solomon. He says later in Ecclesiastes, in chapter 7, he says, a good name is better than precious ointment. And the day of death is death than the day of birth. In other words, it's better when you die than when you're born. He says, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Crackling of thorns is like a fire, by the way. So that's what he's describing as the laughter of fools. And so he says it's better to go to the house of mourning. Sorrow is better than laughing. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. This is kind of a weird concept that really flies in the face of what our culture teaches. But he says there in verse 3, by sadness of faith, the heart is made glad. In James chapter 4, I read this, I think when I was 16 or 17, and in a season of despair. I think, if I remember right, I think a girl had broken up with me or something. It was like that really heavy despair of high school breakups. But I just felt like I couldn't talk to anyone at church about it, and I just happened to be reading James, and I read this. It says, but he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. By the way, this is a passage in the New Testament. So this is written like thousands of years after Solomon has written what he has about it's better to be in the house of mourning. And so James later is kind of reiterating this idea. So just to go through it real quick, he opens with, but he gives more grace. And I love this line because what James has been doing before this passage, he's been rebuking his audience for quarreling and fighting with each other and allowing their sins to kind of war within themselves. But in the middle of his rebuke, he gives this awesome line. There is no more, he gives more grace. So you can't out-sin the grace of God. So it doesn't matter how terrible it is. You've done it the 100th time. You cannot outrun, you cannot out-sin the grace of a holy God. You're just not that big. And then he goes on to say, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. So if you read this on its surface, you can kind of read it like a Puritan, like an angry white dude in like the 1700s. And he's like, cleanse your hands, right? You sinners. But really, this should be read as compassionate. Like, do you feel your own brokenness and the brokenness of the world? Like, I can't think of a phrase I relate to more than double-minded. Like, that is exactly where I find myself oftentimes. And so how does James counsel his broken, double-minded audience to respond? Be wretched and mourn. It's like, I've said this for years. I'm going to actually do it. I want to get a pillow for a couch that has this on it, like cross-stitched, you know? Like, I really do. It's going to happen. My wife will make me keep it in my office. But this goes so against what our culture teaches, right? Because our culture is all about be positive. You can do it. You need to realize your actual self. You need to be more true to yourself. I was told that my whole life growing up, struggling with depression. And the deeper and deeper I dug into myself, the worse I was. Like, it was like a better version of me. That's how I'm going to achieve happiness, but it's never enough. Like, I'm the source of my own problems. How could a better version of me fix the problem? And so what James is saying here is acknowledge your brokenness in a real way before God. Like, it's natural to be broken. We're all broken people living in a broken world, and you don't have to pretend to be better than you are when you're approaching God. There's this notion that you should clean yourself up before you come to God, or like I mentioned earlier, put on your best for God. That does not come from the Bible. That comes from sin, frankly. So this idea of wisdom and how wisdom plays into this is that true wisdom understands the brokenness of the world and of self in light of God. And again, back to that example of what wisdom really means, it's experience, right? As you go through life, you experience your own brokenness, you experience the brokenness of the world, you become more and more aware of your need for God. And the way he concludes it is humble yourselves before the Lord and he will exalt you. And so that inner vanity, that inner feeling of like, I can't ever get better, I can't ever be good enough. The answer from God is not, you can't be good enough, you can do it. The answer from God is, you can't do it, you're not enough, so I did it for you. And if you'll acknowledge that, I'll walk with you and love you all the days of your life. And so the answer to our gloom and our despair when we're wrestling with our own brokenness is just to be honest about it and to go to God. And so to kind of close us out here, false wisdom ignores the reality of death. It ignores the reality of brokenness in the world and the reality of brokenness within. So you can substitute whatever you want to distract yourself from this feeling of like, it's not enough. Like, you can choose a career path. You can make money your ultimate aim in life. Like, for me, what it often is weight loss, to be frank. Like, man, if I just got down to a certain weight, like, then I'll be happy. And it's like, no, you were unhappy back then as well. And if you think of it like a treadmill, like What is the treadmill that you're on that you think you're arriving somewhere that it's never going to take you? So the treadmill of wealth, the treadmill of health, the treadmill of success, the treadmill of family. Like, what is the thing in your life that you think is going to fulfill you? Solomon's going to say it's not going to fulfill you ultimately. And so true wisdom acknowledges the reality of death. It acknowledges the reality of brokenness in the world, and it acknowledges the reality of brokenness within. And so, to expand a little bit more, it humbles itself before God. It knows there's more than what is under the sun. And it lives in light of God, who is beyond the sun. And I don't have a slide for this, but there was a book that we've been reading about the book of Ecclesiastes, and he describes it so well that when it comes to the various aspects of life, like family and wealth and sex and whatever else, like these are good things that are designed by God. But when you make those things ultimate things, you make those things the purpose of your life, you will end up more broken and despairing than you were when you started. And so what understanding this vanity really frees us from is it frees us from the trap of believing that we can be fulfilled by these things, and then we can actually enjoy them for what they are. So for example, I'm a pretty insecure guy. I've grown a lot, but when my wife and I were dating, I would look for her validation in order for me to feel okay, right? Like if she's mad at me, I can't be happy. If she's upset with me, my whole world is in disarray. And it was a huge turning point in our relationship when we were dating, when I kind of realized this idea of like, wait, my wife will never make me ultimately happy. Love you, babe. Like she can't be the source of my ultimate happiness, because she will always fail that. Like if you pedestal your spouse and make them God in your life, you will burn them out and chase them off because they can't live up to that. And so understanding who God is and understanding my wife in light of who God is allows me to fully enjoy her, because my security is not found in my wife. My security is found in my relationship with God. You can apply that concept to any area of life, money, to career, whatever. If you understand life in light of who God really is and what he says life is all about, you actually will experience full joy out of those things, because then a good steak can just be a good steak. Then a good time out can just be a good time out. And it doesn't have to be your ultimate source of validation and identity. And so just know there is more than what is under the sun, and you can live in light of God who is beyond the sun. So that's kind of our time today. So I brought Homer back. You have any questions or comments? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Right. Sure. Like inner depression or vanity or yeah, absolutely. Yeah. 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 Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. You're good. I'm a verbal processor. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. No, thank you, man. I mean, yeah. Right. Right. Absolutely, man. That's people watching on Zoom. I can't really repeat that. That was like excellent. Or I can't like do justice to that. Like it's such a good point. The great command from Jesus is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Like that's the overarching ethic of Jesus. And both of those things are like not about you. Like the more that you can get outside of yourself, the more that you can be freed from believing that you can make yourself happy. And I would also say, man, like I relate to everything you just said. Like the self-fulfilling circle of despair is like you feel like crap, you feel like life is pointless, so you stay in bed and you eat. And I'm talking about myself actually. You eat junk food, so you feel like crap, so you stay in bed. So you like it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. And what the gospel of Jesus says is that you can break out of that. It's not right away. It's not a magic bullet. It takes time. It takes growing in the truth of God. And the best lies from the enemy and the best lies that you believe are 99% true. So if you have the thought of I'm worthless, God could never love me, God doesn't say, no, you're awesome. God says, well, you are kind of worthless. You do fall short, but I've loved you anyways. This idea of agape love that we talked about at House Church a few weeks ago. Like God moves towards us in our brokenness. So it's not when we're better that he loves us. It's when we're at our absolute worst that he's moving towards us. And I would also encourage getting involved in community and inviting other people into that has helped me a lot. But no, thank you for sharing, man. That's awesome. So I'm gonna follow that up. Yeah. 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 So it's a great question. Man, I like you. We haven't met. I'm Jason. So there's actually a point, I almost included it, but I didn't have time, where Solomon actually says, he's in the middle of kind of reflecting on this vanity of life. And he says, I can't remember exactly how he puts it, but basically, for no man can save his own spirit and no man can restore himself from death. And it's like, well, what we know now, that Jesus did save and restore his own spirit. Jesus did fulfill his own death. And so what we see on this side of 3,000 years is that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's will in the world. To answer your question about how did Solomon see grace, like I mentioned, actually at the end of his life, he loses God's favor because he allows his wives to kind of lead him astray. Now, he doesn't fall out of God's ultimate favor. There's a concept that I'm forgetting the word for of kind of backwards grace, basically, that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus extends to our brothers and sisters in the past before he lived as well, and those who were faithful to God then. So, Stu, is that fair summary? And Todd? Yeah. Yeah. And as we yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Todd? Hesed? Yeah. And it allows you to read their lives and not be God and judge them. Because like you read about David's a bum. Like he steals another man's wife and has him killed. He sucks. He's not a hero. There's one hero in the Bible, and there's a bunch of idiots, basically. But understanding this idea of backwards grace allows you not only to kind of have grace for them, but also put yourselves in their shoes and realize like, we're not any better than they are. C.S. Lewis had this idea of chronological snobbery. It's this idea of like looking back through the centuries and like up down our nose at like, oh, those idiots, those savages. And again, like look at what cell phones have done to us. We haven't figured it out. But Jenna? So yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to say I want to clarify. This is me speaking. This is my opinion, so I can't say that this is definitely it. This is what I think. I think that God used Solomon to demonstrate this idea that life under the sun is fleeting, and so God allowed Solomon to pursue, like I said at the beginning, like he he's doing all this intentional. He's not just living for himself for no reason. He's wanting to see what life is all about. And so these various ventures in life, he actually at one point says, in the midst of like the party section that Jeff will talk about next week, he says, I didn't lose my wisdom, meaning like I'm intentionally pursuing these things to see if they're really of any lasting value. And so, yes, he was definitely acting in sin, but that's what the whole idea of grace. Like he was why wisdom. No, you are. This is my sister, by the way. This is just a Tuesday. Do you not abuse God's grace? Not to say like. Yeah, I mean, sorry if that was. I do too. Just to be clear, we all do. Like that's the idea. Sorry, that was heavy. But yeah, no, I think that he did. But God uses. Todd's gonna laugh. God uses crooked sticks to make straight paths. I used to think that was a Bible verse. It's just a Southern saying. It's this idea of like God works in the midst of our brokenness. And uses it for greater purposes. And the Bible, and part of the reason for that we have the Bible is to learn from the experiences of our past, brothers and sisters and their mistakes. And so, yeah, wisdom doesn't equal perfect living, right? It just means like knowledge that comes from experience. And anyone who's older than 40 will tell you, like, the more you screw up, the more you learn, the wiser you get. So you really only develop wisdom by screwing up, generally. He did. Early on. And then he grew more and more wise. And then he was depressed. Selah. Yeah. Well, it's not just experience. Like, there's wise young men who just have a good sense for the world. But that's a part of it. Yeah. Yeah. You're okay, Thomas. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. Right. That's a great point. And it's another thing I didn't put in, I was going to, is like, if you read Proverbs, which again, the book of Proverbs is mostly written by Solomon, it's kind of surprisingly optimistic considering Ecclesiastes. Like, it's all these sayings about how to live a well-lived life. And you can kind of see Solomon's youth in Proverbs of like, do this and life will go well. But then in Ecclesiastes, like we read, it's like the race doesn't always go to the swift. The war doesn't always go to the strong. Like, you can do everything right. Like, eat all the kale you want, eat, do Pilates, live a healthy life, and you can still have a heart attack at 33. Yeah, there are general principles in life, but the general entropy and disorder of the universe and the brokenness of the world is still present. And so, yeah, I like that a lot, Todd. Of like, Ecclesiastes is his reflection at the end of like, oh man, it's all vanity. So, Thomas? Yeah. Right. Yes, that's a great point. One of the most famous passages in the Bible is Romans 8, where it's like, neither height nor depth nor angels nor demons nor anything can separate us from the love of God. And this idea of like, God is eternal in everything that he does and infinite and beyond us. And again, going back to James 4, like, he gives more grace. So as we struggle and imperfectly follow him, he's continually lavishing grace upon us, which allows us to walk in freedom, to know that we're reconciled to our God and we don't have to feel shame or guilt anymore. And in Ephesians, it says that we can boldly approach the throne of grace because of that. So, one more? Stu?
That observation lines up really well. Whereas I think put aside that lens and don't make a number of like, why is the point? So like, that's an important question. Narratives for the way to do this.
Yeah.
I just find the Bible satisfactory.
Yeah.
We observe this to be the case, and I experience this to be the case. I mean, for me personally, our experience in the foster system has been like upfront in your face. The world is a really messy, broken place.
Yeah.
And it's just very comforting to know that's God's perspective. I'm not like totally out of whack with the world. No, this is how things should be. It's like,
Yeah.
no, this is
Right. Yeah. And I think that's something that turns a lot of non-Christians off, is this feeling of they're not willing to address reality as it is. It's like they're living in a fantasy. It's like, no, if you're living according to the Bible's pretty brutally honest about the brokenness of the world, but it also offers a solution in Jesus. And so in Jesus, we see God made manifest. And so if you want to know what God's like, look at Jesus. And he lives life as it was supposed to be lived, which is in light of God who is beyond the sun. So, well, it's 12:30. So why don't we close there? We'll have one or two people pray, and then we can all hang out. And yeah.
roses and unicorns. They're, it's just kind of the reality. And thank you that that's documented. And thank you don't leave us in that you come with us.
Amen. Yeah, God, I totally agree with that. Thankful that the vanity of the world, the fleeting nature of life, and the reality of death is not the end of all things for us, but we know that you are present with us and that you sent Jesus to live in this broken world. Your word says that we have a great high priest who's able to sympathize with our weaknesses. So we know that Jesus wept, Jesus cried, Jesus felt, I'm sure at times, this vanity, this feeling of the world being broken. And I'm really thankful, like Noah said, that that's not the end all be all, but that you are restoring all things. Your word says that you're coming to make all things new, and that we can be redeemed and we can be made whole with you. And we don't have to go through life alone. So we love you, God. Thank you for this time, and pray you'd help us have a good week. In Jesus' name, amen. And meeting.